Hello, my name is Emily Prud'hommeaux. I am an assistant professor of computer science at Boston College in Massachusetts in the United States, and I'll be presenting joint work with two of my students, Ethan Morris and Robbie Jimerson, who are students at the Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York, and also in the United States. And I will be talking about our work on investigating the utility of custom ASR architectures for existing African language corpora. So I want to explain a little bit why we are interested in this particular topic. So my students and I have for a number of years been developing an ASR system and experimenting with different ASR systems for a language called Seneca, which is a Native American language spoken in New York State and in Ontario in Canada. That is very, very endangered. There are about 50 first language speakers left, and then maybe another 100 second language speakers. And as a result, there's a whole lot of data that we will lose when these elders die. We're trying to transcribe it in order to support the community in its language revitalization and instruction programs. And so as a result, we've experimented with a lot of the different available architectures that have been shown to be good for low resource scenarios. And we've developed one of our own, and we were curious about whether it could be used for other low resource languages. Now, the majority of the world's languages are considered under-resourced or low-resource or resource-constrained, even if they have tens or hundreds of millions of speakers, right? The high-resource languages, you can probably count on one hand. These are the ones that you have hundreds or thousands of hours of audio recordings that you could use to train an ASR model. Most of the world's languages don't have that much data. So even though the situation with Seneca is very different, from something like Wolof or Amharic, which are the two languages from Africa that I will be talking about today, it's possible that the techniques we've developed will also be applicable there. So some of the research questions we're interested in answering here have to do not only with how well those different architectures work in terms of decreasing word error rates, but also things like linguistic and typological features and properties of audio recordings themselves. So perhaps it's the case that one architecture might work really well for a language with a complex morphology, or a language with a large phone set or a small phone set, or a language that has a syllabic orthography versus an alphabet orthography. Or perhaps the conditions under which the recordings were made could have a big impact. Were the recordings made in a quiet room or in a sound booth? How many different kinds of speakers did you have producing the recordings? Were the recordings read speech or were they spontaneous speech? And so that's the sort of stuff we're going to be exploring here. I want to talk a little bit about the features and the architectures that we explored. So in all cases, our features are just MFCCs. They're deltas and they're delta-deltas. This is like the pretty basic standard ASR features for decades now. There are other ways to do it, but that's what we used here. And then we're going to be looking at three different architectures. Two of them are architectures that you can choose from the Kaldi ASR toolkit. Kaldi is the main open source ASR toolkit that's available these days. It is certainly the most widely used at this point. And we looked at two architectures that have been shown to give good results on small corpora. One is an SGMM. These other, so it's a non-neural model. And then we also looked at sort of a relatively simple deep neural network. And then we're comparing that with our own fully convolutional ASR framework that we developed specifically for Seneca, which is called WireNet. And I should add that although all of three systems will be using the same features, the Kaldi systems have additional feature enhancements having to do with dimensionality reduction and also speaker normalization. Which we will see will come into play shortly. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the language corpora, how they're similar, how they're different. These are the three languages we're looking at. The first is Seneca, obviously not an African language, but the language the language for which we are developing an ASR system for our own research reasons. It's a very small corpus, and it has a very small number of speakers. As I say, this is an endangered language. There are only about 50 speakers living today, people who speak it as a first language. So we have about 11 speakers, and the corpus was deliberately produced in such a way that every speaker who appears in the training data also appears in the test data. The idea is to be able to train models that will transcribe existing corpora, existing recordings that have not yet been transcribed. We have about 10 hours of training data, 2 hours of testing data. The signal-to-noise ratio is somewhat high. We have a very small corpus for training our language model, only 49,000 words, because that is all of the written text that is available in Seneca. The orthography for Seneca is a pretty good one-to-one mapping of a grapheme to sound, and there are 27 characters in the alphabet that is used. It's extremely complex morphology. It's polysynthetic. The morphemes themselves are fusional. And the speech type is spontaneous. These are just casual conversations or people telling stories. You know, full of plenty of disfluencies and things like that. The Wolof corpus we used it's slightly bigger. It's about 50% bigger, but it has a similar number of speakers. But in this case, the speakers are disjoint in the training and test set. So there are no speakers in the training set who will also appear in the test set. Similarly high signal to noise ratio, a much larger language model, but a similar orthography, okay? It's also alphabetic, it's also pretty one-to-one, it's 29 characters, also has an agglutinative, complex morphology, but in this case, it's read speech. And finally, we have the Amharic corpus, which is twice as big as the Seneca corpus, and has an order of magnitude more speakers than either of the other two corpora, 124 speakers overall. Again, no overlap in speakers between the training set and the test set, much lower signal noise ratio. Again, several orders of magnitude larger text from which to train the language model. And interestingly, also a much bigger character system. So it's a syllabic writing system rather than an alphabetic writing system. And there are at least 270 characters for writing Amharic. It also has complex morphology, slightly different. It's a root pattern morphology with agglutinative characteristics as well. But like Wolof, it is read speech. So you can see there are Wolof and Seneca share some characteristics. Amharic and Wolof share some characteristics. There's actually not that much there are not that many shared characteristics between the Seneca dataset and the Amharic dataset, other than they both have complex morphology, but different kinds of complex morphology. So I'd like to look at the results. And here I'm just looking at word error rate over the 3 different architectures and in the 2 African languages over the 2 different train test splits. So first, let's look at Seneca. We have the 2 different architectures, and in Seneca, recall, we do not have a data set that is disjoint. There are always going to be speakers in the training set that are in the test set, specifically because we're actually trying to develop a transcription system that will be able to transcribe speakers it's already heard before, because there's a limited number of people who actually speak the language. And we see that WireNet, our own convolutional framework, actually outperforms the other 2 by a pretty wide margin here. But when we look at Wolof, we have some different kinds of results. So we see that when the training and test set do not contain the same speakers, we see that WireNet actually does worse than the other 2 frameworks. The other 2 frameworks are pretty comparable. When we look again at a Wolof data set where we have made sure that every speaker appears in both the training and the test set, we see again that WireNet does much better, very significantly better than the other 2 architectures. And furthermore, both quality architectures actually get worse once there is speaker overlap. So we see in this case that WireNet does hold some advantages over the 2 Kaldi models. Now, this all changes when we look at Amharic. First of all, the overall error rates are not really comparable at all compared to Seneca and Wolof. Seneca and Wolof are pretty similar. Amharic has very, very low error rates. And we see that even when there is speaker overlap in the training and test set, WireNet does much worse. So the SGMM and the DNN from Kaldi are comparable. WireNet is much worse, both when there is no overlap in the training and test set, and when there is. So what are some possible reasons for this? So we saw here that the 2 Kaldi models are pretty comparable for all 3 languages. But we see that WireNet does much better for Wolof when there is overlap between the training and testing data with speakers. Whereas that is not the case in Amharic. And we would like to know, like, why is this the case? And there are a number of possible reasons. In particular, if you look at the chart at the top, Wolof and Seneca have both have small alphabetic writing systems, whereas Amharic is a large syllabary writing system. The Seneca and Wolof data sets are smaller than the Amharic data sets. They have high signal to noise ratio, and they also have very few speakers. The Amharic data set has 124 speakers, Wolof has 16, Seneca has 11. So it's not clear what the cause of this variation is, but there are a number of possible culprits. And so our future work is going to focus on trying to figure this out. And in fact, we're right now preparing another paper where we look at 4 or 5 other languages whose corpus characteristics and linguistic characteristics are we're looking at a variety of different languages that share some of those characteristics with Seneca, Wolof, and Amharic, and some that do not, to try to figure out if we can get to the bottom of this. I mean, and I guess in short, what we believe is that, you know, there may be no one particular right answer what is the best way to go about developing an ASR system, and maybe that you have to tailor it to the particular characteristics of your language. These are some resources where we got these corpora, where we got these models, and just a disclaimer, this is supported by the National Science Foundation, but does not necessarily reflect their views.